Hello there and welcome back. This is Jennifer McGuire. I have heard that many of you, like me, have enjoyed using alcohol ink again lately. So I thought I would share with you today a technique that is an oldie but goodie, and this involves stamping on alcohol ink to get ghost-like images. Man, this is a technique I learned probably, 10 years ago from Tim Holtz, and thankfully he gave me permission to share it with you today. I really think you'll like the results that you get. If you haven't watched my kind of introduction to alcohol inked backgrounds, I would recommend watching that video now, and I'll link to it here, because that's a good foundation for the technique that I'm sharing today. So I'm using Tim Holtz alcohol inks. You can see they come in many colors. This is how I like to store mine because I've been using them a lot lately. I have this one for all my colored alcohol inks. Then I have another tier where I keep my neutral colors, my metallic mixatives, and some tools. This tier organizer is very handy, and I'll link to the one that I use. But there is another storage option that I wanted to mention. A lot of people have asked me about this. There is the Tim Holtz Alcohol Ink Storage Tin. Now I just got mine and I'm trying it out, and it's nice because it holds the alcohol ink securely in there and it closes and you can latch it shut. This holds, I think, 30 inks, and you can also put other small bottles in here if you want to. So that's another great storage option. I just wanted to share those quickly. Okay, so let's dive into creating a quick background. Again, I'm not going to show creating a bunch of basic alcohol inked backgrounds today, since I have so many videos showing that. Again, check out that video if you haven't already. But I'll share 2 of the alcohol inked backgrounds and then a bunch of examples where I add the stamping. Okay, so I'm applying alcohol inks to Tim Holtz Yupo paper. You want to use a non-porous surface for this, such as Yupo paper, which is a synthetic paper. You can also use acetate, which I'll show you at the end of this video, or anything else non-porous, such as glass or metals. All I'm doing is trying to apply a pretty even coat of alcohol ink. So I apply it and I'm moving it around with a brush, and I'm blowing it with a straw to kind of smooth it out. I find that this technique works best if you have more of a smooth alcohol inked background instead of one that has lots of texture, or areas where the ink is really thick and other areas where it's really thin. So I'll set that one aside. Let's create one more background and then we'll get to the stamping. Here I'm using a Tim Holtz felt alcohol ink applicator. There's a piece of felt on this applicator, and I'm applying my alcohol ink to that felt and then brushing it back and forth on the paper. This creates more of a controlled background, so if you like that look, this is one way you can do it. I'm starting more with yellows at the top and working my way to darker pink at the bottom. You can see even after you apply the ink, it still is moving a little bit and kind of blending in with the colors next to it. I decided I wanted this darker, so I'm going to keep adding a little bit more color until I'm happy with the results. This is a great way to create an alcohol ink background for the stamping technique that I'm going to show you. Okay, now the stamps that I'm using today are from Simon's Stamp. On the left, we have the Bold Flowers stamp set, and on the right, we have the Even More Spring Flowers stamp set, which I used on a video yesterday also. You really can use any stamps for this technique, but I personally like more outline images or images that don't have too much solid area, but you really can use anything. Now, in order to do the technique that I'm sharing with you today, where you get a ghost-like stamp image, you need to use Ranger Archival Ink. This is a unique ink that is oil-based, and it stamps permanently, like on regular cardstock or even glossy cardstock. It is available in full-size pads and also these cute little cubes that you see here. Now, you could just use the black archival, which many people have. It's a nice, great black permanent ink. But there are also these beautiful colors, and I'm going to use a mix. The color really doesn't matter as much as you think it would. So I'll explain that in this video. Now, I know someone will ask of other inks that would work for this technique, and I honestly don't know of any. So if you're going to get one archival ink pad, if you don't have the black, which I know many people do, I recommend getting like a light gray or a light color, and you'll see why here. Okay, so here I'm taking one of the pink archival inks, and I'm stamping it on my alcohol ink background. Now, very quickly, I'm coming in with an old rag, this is actually an old t-shirt, and rubbing the ink away. It gives a resist look. So I stamp it, very quickly I come and rub it away. I know that when Tim does this technique, he dabs a lot of the excess ink away before rubbing it, but I guess I was lazy and I just decided to go in and rub the ink away right away. If you let it sit, that ink becomes permanent. It'll just dry there and you'll get a beautiful stamped image on this Yupo paper alcohol ink background. But if you wipe it away, look at these ghost-like images you get that are beautiful. Now I used pink on this one. I used a pink archival ink. And now I'm actually switching to orange to show you that it really doesn't matter. Whatever ink color you do this with, it will leave a little residue of color. So that's why I picked a color that matched my background. But I'm going to show you later, you really could just use black if you wanted to. And it just gives you like a light gray ghost image. And I'll show you that soon. Here's another background. That last one had those stripes across it. This one is the other one that I created where I dropped the alcohol ink on and moved it around with a paintbrush. So this one actually has more alcohol ink on it. I decided to use my MISTI for this to show you another thing that you can do to intensify that ghost look. So here I'm stamping with a turquoise archival ink, and I'm going to wipe it away with a dry cloth. Now, if you want to intensify that, you can repeat it again. And that's the advantage of using a stamping tool. It's stamping in the exact same spot, so I can remove even more of the alcohol ink and make the ghost image pop even more. So now that I've done that, I'll go ahead and move some stamps around and continue to stamp and wipe away the ink on the entire background. Now, here's the thing. If you have a background with really thick layers of alcohol ink in some areas and lighter alcohol ink areas in others, you won't get as crisp of a look. So I do recommend kind of creating a simple alcohol ink background, like the ones that I'm using today. This one has a lot of variation right in the middle, so some of the images kind of get lost on that, but I still think it creates a really fun look. And by stamping it twice and wiping the ink away twice, I can intensify it. Okay, here's another example. This one you can see has a lot of alcohol ink on it. And this time I'm stamping with black archival ink. I know many people have black archival ink, so I wanted to show you that it does work for this technique. It leaves a little bit of a light gray residue behind, but it still looks lovely as you can see here. Now, if you don't have any archival inks, but want to try this technique, I recommend getting a light color of archival ink, because the lighter the color, the less noticeable residue it will leave behind. But as you can see from today's video, I use an assortment of colors, and it really does work no matter what the color is. Okay, now I have a green alcohol inked background that I created on Yupo paper. And this time I'm going to stamp kind of an arrangement of flowers and leaves in the center. Now this one does have a lot of variation to the background. It has some thick areas and some thin areas. So you'll see that you get a variation in how much of the ghost images you see. In this one, I also chose to stamp some solid images to show you that it does work for solid stamps too. But I really like more of the thin lined images. I think you can see it better because there's a lot of definition to it. I do recommend, if you are stamping a very solid image or something that's very large, to first dab some of the ink away with a dry cloth and then kind of swipe it away. That will give you better results. But whenever you do this, you want to make sure to start wiping the ink away pretty immediately because you don't want it to dry on that Yupo paper. I also wanted to show you this works great for background stamps. I decided to use the Simon Says Stamp Center Cut Heart background stamp. It's one of my favorites. I'm positioning the Yupo paper centered on my background, closing the MISTI on it upside down, and now I know that it's positioned to be stamped right in the center of that paper. I'm inking this up with archival ink, and I'll stamp it into my alcohol ink background. Now this alcohol ink background had a lot going on it. So I do want to stamp this a couple times to really allow it to show, since there are some really thick areas of alcohol ink. Now, one background stamp that I think is great with this technique, and what I used to use all the time, is like a textbook background stamp. I didn't do it in this video, but it's one that works really good for creating a ghost-like image on top of your alcohol ink background. So here you can see the look that you get from this. It's just such a unique look. Now earlier in the video, I mentioned that in addition to Yupo paper, you can do this technique on acetate. I use Judikins Embossable window plastic, but you can use any kind of transparency or acetate. I'm applying alcohol ink onto it. You can see I get my head in the way of the camera because I'm blowing onto the alcohol ink to kind of make it smooth out. Next, I'll just quickly give this a little bit of heat to dry it, and then we can start stamping on it with Archival Ink, just as we did before. But when you do the stamping on the transparency, check this out. It looks so crisp. You do again want to make sure you don't have any globs of alcohol ink in the background because that makes it more difficult to get a clear, crisp image. But I just love the results. I had forgotten that this technique worked on acetate, and Tim reminded me of it today, and I'm really glad he did because the results are just gorgeous. Whenever I create a stamped acetate piece for my cards, I like to add it to the card with a little dimension. So here I created a white piece of cardstock with a die-cut rectangle center, so it'll be a nice frame. I'm adhering my alcohol ink transparency onto it, and I put it so that the alcohol ink side is facing the card. After adding foam tape around the edges, I'm putting this onto a white note card, and I really love that raised look of that stamped acetate piece. It just creates such a beautiful shadowy effect in there. And I'll show you a closer look at this later on in this video when we finish that card up. Okay, so let's take these backgrounds and turn them into cards. I tried to keep them simple so the attention would be on those backgrounds that we created. So for several of my examples, I actually adhered that background at an angle, just for a little bit of interest. I used regular adhesive to do so. After I put it kind of at an angle on the front of the card, I flipped the card over and trimmed off the excess. All of these cards are 4 1/4 by 5 1/2, and the alcohol ink panels that I created earlier are all 5 by 3 1/2. Now the sentiments on all of my cards today use the Simon Says Stamp Big Thanks word die set. This cuts the word thanks and the die to cut the shadow for that word. And then I also used 2 sentiment stamp sets, including the Simon Says Stamp Big Thanks Words stamp set. This has lots of small sentiments that work great along with the die cut or for the inside of cards. I used both of these on yesterday's video. I'm also using another great Simon Says Stamp set that is new. Lots of unique sentiments on here, and I just think they're so much fun. So I use those on a few of the cards also. I'm stamping a sentiment along the bottom edge of the alcohol ink panel on the front of my card, and I'm using some Simon Says Stamp die ink that just happens to match the alcohol ink background that I created. Now that thanks die cut that you see over there on the left, the shadow to the word thanks I cut from white cardstock. Then I die cut 2 thanks die cuts and glued them on top. And then the third layer, that top thanks, that I just die cut from some alcohol ink backgrounds that I created. It was just a scrap piece, and it matches that background perfectly. You could instead use a pink or red cardstock if you wanted to. So here's a closer look. I just look at that gorgeous ghost-like stamping. Now to create that alcohol ink Yupo paper, I used some pink, reds, and a little bit of orange alcohol ink. So here's another example. This is the one where I did kind of the striped background with my alcohol ink applicator and the alcohol inks. I added the sentiments towards the top of this one. And here I'm adding some Pink and Main glossy dots. These come in the silver and then a pack of different colors. And I think they're a great accent for these cards. They're very simple. They're kind of flat, not too much bulk, and they give a lot of shine. You can see how this card was pretty quick to pull together. And if you wanted to save time, you could use a background stamp for the ghost stamping instead of a bunch of little images as I did here. But I really like this stamp set, so I wanted to use it for this technique. Here's the other background that I created earlier in this video, and you can see the different leaf images that I used in the background. I again used a scrap of the alcohol ink background for my thanks die cut, and I added that onto some white die cuts, along with a simple sentiment stamped below that, and a few of the Pink and Main glossy dots. Here is the alcohol ink on the acetate piece that we created. You can see that beautiful kind of stained glass look that you get in the background there. My top thanks die cut is silver glitter cardstock from Simon Says Stamp. And the stamp sentiment says, "Your awesomeness is boundless." I just think that's so much fun. Now here is the green alcohol ink on Yupo paper. The top die cut on this one is a gold glitter cardstock from Simon Says Stamp. And I again added those glossy dots from Pink and Maine. But these glossy dots have like a yellowish green tint to them. Perfect for this background. Since all of these backgrounds are so rich and have so much depth to them, I feel like the rest of the card should be pretty simple. As you can see with this one, I just did the thanks die cut, a simple sentiment strip, and that's it. I feel like the background kind of speaks for itself, so you can quickly finish these cards off. I do like that the Yupo paper has a bit of a shine to it, so the final card has a little shine to it also. It's really pretty. Here's another example. I actually have a smaller piece here because I messed up part of it, so I just trimmed it down. Even a small piece works great for this technique. So here I did blue and purple alcohol inks on Yupo paper, stamped with the Archival ink, and you get those beautiful leaves. And here's the piece that I showed you earlier where I stamped with black Archival ink to show that that ink even works well for this technique. To show you a comparison, I created an alcohol ink background on Yupo paper, and I cut it in half. On the card on the left, I used that background and I stamped with a light blue Archival ink on top of it. The card on the right, I stamped the black Archival ink on top of it. So you can see how the card on the left is a little more vibrant, and the ghost stamping on the card on the right is a little more soft gray because the black ink does leave a bit of residue, but it works great too. Now before we go, I did want to talk about cleanup because alcohol inks and Archival ink, they're pretty tough to clean up. So on my MISTI, I use the Novus Cleaner, and you can see if you spray it on and scrub with a dry cloth, you can get the stains out. But I will admit to you a deep, dark secret. Don't tell anybody, but I usually clean my MISTI with an alcohol swab. I know that's crazy, but I've always done it, and I don't know that you're supposed to, but I've never had problems, and it cleans up everything great. I will say that my MISTI mouse pad is stained a little bit from that Archival ink, even though I did use an alcohol swab on it. So keep that in mind. If you're going to use that Archival ink in your MISTI, instead of using the MISTI mouse pad, use the paper sheets so that you can just take them out when you're done. But I was able to clean up my MISTI itself perfectly using the Novus Cleaner and a little bit of alcohol swabs. Oh, and by the way, I did all of my alcohol ink work today on my Tim Holtz glass media mat, and it cleans up great with a little bit of hand sanitizer or alcohol swabs. It's definitely my favorite new surface to do alcohol inks on. Okay, there you have another alcohol ink technique. I hope this inspires you to give it a try. My YouTube description below has all the supplies that I used. In the middle are a couple other videos that might inspire you. I appreciate you stopping by today. I hope to see you again soon and have a wonderful week.